Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Thomas D.
And me, Rob Cockerell.
And Rob, we're back here in the studio. We've had a week off now after getting over that European CO2 Summit triple header, but great to revisit that event, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. What a wonderful week to have not been on air as well. Spring has sprung here in the UK, hasn't it?
It's been fantastic, hasn't it? Yeah.
So hot. Costa del Cornwall, as they call it.
Wow. For those who weren't enjoying the heat, they could enjoy that full DAC panel, which we uploaded 2 weeks ago now.
I think it was. Yeah, a lot of loaded conversation in there. Really enjoyed doing that, and then listening back to it.
Yeah, fantastic. But this week we're gonna move away from the CO2 theme and revisit a theme, I suppose, that we've covered
extensively
a number of times on this podcast, but also fairly recently on this podcast too, maybe a month or two ago, and that is, of course, the theme of hydrogen, something we can't get away from. Yeah,
exactly. We need to redress the balance somewhat, don't we, with that last episode, I think.
Yes, because on March 12th we released an episode and we titled it, Where Did It Go Wrong for Hydrogen, which was for balance, because we did upload a number of hydrogen episodes around there with some great case studies, but we also had to address sort of
the elephant in the room,
the speed bump that the hydrogen industry is going through, and it was definitely needed, that episode, wasn't it?
It was, and we stand by that. Maybe an emotive title, but we were trying to unpack, weren't we? Look, where has this kind of, if hydrogen hit a bit of a fork in the road in the last couple of years in particular, where did that happen and why did it happen? And I think it was important to get that out.
Yeah, and we did reel off a number of projects or companies that maybe are struggling financially or have gone bankrupt, but it really isn't all doom and gloom, is it? Because there's so much good out there in the hydrogen industry too.
Not at all. I mean, it's more that the challenges with scale up, with infrastructure, with applications development, they're all far more heightened than we perhaps ever expected. I think we said this in the last episode on hydrogen, that we knew this crystallization and this kind of, I don't know, the reality kicking in was going to happen at some point, but it's been far more stark than we could have envisaged. And then we've also got all of this geopolitical and economic uncertainty all around the world. And that's thrown more than a significant curveball or two into the whole investment climate. And then really, I think there's impact on policy as well with that, of course. And then suddenly all of these headwinds just leave us with a somewhat deep and enduring hydrogen winter. That's kind of where we're at. If we were summing up some of that episode as well, that would be it. But as you said, it's not all doom and gloom. There are bright spots. There are, if we keep that winter analogy going, there are pockets of sunshine and bright spells out there. There are things to look forward to, and we do just need a bit of perspective.
Yeah, we really do. And look, 2025 has got off to a strong start despite those projects we said that collapsed or went bankrupt. 2025 has got off to an extremely strong start in this hydrogen space. I mean, let's start with FID, final investment decisions. This is always one of the number one talking points, whether it's on a hydrogen podcast like we're doing now or one of our webinars. FID is always one of the key speed bumps, as I said earlier, to getting a project over the line. But a number have passed this FID threshold this year already. I've picked out a few. The first one I'd like to bring your attention to is the Luxara and Green H 20 megawatt Norwegian green hydrogen plant, which has taken FID, and that was from January this year. We reported on that on h2-view.com, and this is where the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment, through its state-owned enterprise Enova, did grant NOK 129 million euros in funding support, which has enabled the two companies to make the FID. So that's a fantastic news story, and Norway, of course, a real hotspot for hydrogen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the next story is on Norway as well, isn't it? I think it will be these pockets, the smaller scale investments and projects that are ultimately going to kind of bring the pieces of the puzzle together. So yeah, and a good one there. 5 years ago we were talking about some of the innovative groundbreaking projects in Sweden, and it's those countries, it's those smaller scale innovators and the people that are prepared to put some energy and some funding into it that will make this happen.
And like you said, let's stick in Norway and go to a story which was a month ago now. We uploaded this, and Norwegian Hydrogen takes final investment decision on a 25 megawatt green hydrogen plant in Rjukan. I'm not Norwegian by any stretch of the imagination, as you can probably tell by that pronunciation. But yeah, another fantastic step in the Norwegian hydrogen economy, the hydrogen ecosystem. This is a project that was acquired from Aker Horizons earlier this year, and it includes a power purchase agreement with local utility Tin Energy to guarantee renewable electricity supply. Nel will supply the 25 megawatt alkaline electrolyzer system. So again, another exciting project in the Scandinavia region.
Another smaller scale success story.
And this final one I'd like to speak about on sort of achieving FID is BP taking FID on a 100 megawatt Lingen green hydrogen plant with commissioning set for 2027. This was just at the end of last year that they achieved FID on this, but this has been supported by funding from important projects of common European interest programme, and the plant could produce up to 11,000 tonnes of green hydrogen per year, which BP will use in their refineries and other industrial customers in the region too.
Yeah, and Germany, of course, has this planned hydrogen core network spanning quite some distance, actually. So I think that project will be connected to it, won't it?
I think it will be, yes. And as I said, commissioning starting planned for 2027, so just a couple of years away. So exciting times there, and across Europe, looking at those three stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we said, it is these small pockets, it's these things that are happening, these smaller scale investments taking FID and being realised in the next few years that will start to prove the point for hydrogen. That's what we need to see.
So there's a number of projects that have achieved FID in the last 5-6 months, but there are more expected this year too, aren't there?
Yes, there are. Yeah, in various parts of the world, in fact. I think we see a few in South America, don't we?
Yeah, and this is something we spoke about on a recent webinar where we were discussing large-scale projects. We'll get more on that later, but South America and Brazil in particular, we're seeing becoming a real hotspot for this hydrogen activity, and that is essentially down to the low cost of electricity over there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think, we talked about the parts of Scandinavia that are doing this, they're just taking it and doing it in an innovative manner. But then we always knew that there would be hotspots in various parts of the world where the fundamentals for hydrogen or green hydrogen are far more favourable, where you've got the climate, you've got the right weather conditions, you've got the right kind of how can we put it, grid set up to make it happen. So it's no surprise that you see South America, parts of Africa, and then of course parts of the APAC region, almost those, the islands and everything that will make this happen. So yeah, what's going on in Brazil?
Yeah, on that theme, let me bring your attention to this story where Brazil have backed a 3 gigawatt green hydrogen plant with major tax breaks, with FID expected later this year. So this is a story from about 2 months ago where the Brazilian government has granted this 3 gigawatt green hydrogen and ammonia project CapEx and OpEx tax exemptions as the developer prepares to take final investment decision later this year. This is from solar developer Solacio, and they plan to bring the project in the Parnaíba export processing zone, which is in the state of Piau. This will be done in 3 consecutive 1 gigawatt phases per year, with that first phase planned to come online in January 2029. So again, only 4 years away, but great to see South America getting in on this hydrogen action.
Yeah, I mean, great to see talking about some gigawatt scale numbers there, and also that modular approach, that kind of let's do the building blocks 1 gigawatt at a time. Good.
And we do understand that in this particular project, that offtake agreements are still currently undergoing negotiations, but the majority of this plant's output is planned to be exported to both the European and Asian markets. So definitely one we'll be keeping an eye on at H2View. I would also like to stay in South America for this one, and this is a story that Atome has inked a $465 million EPC deal for a 145 megawatt green hydrogen fertilizer project in Paraguay. We spoke about this a little on the webinar last week, so listeners can go and watch that on gasworld.tv. But this is a good story, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, another promising story in South America. Some modest figures behind it, but also we've got an expected FID by mid-2025. So in many ways, any day now, I guess.
I mean, yeah, considering we are recording this on May 1st to break the fourth wall, I suppose, for the listeners. But yeah, that can't be far away now. And the final project I'd like to bring your attention to is another project where FID is planned in 2025 later this year, and this is for a 600 megawatt Angolan green hydrogen project. This is from the Angola state-owned oil and gas company Sonangol, and they plan to make that in final investment decision on what will be the country's first green hydrogen project later this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the CEO of that project kind of underlined something I was saying earlier, quoted as saying, Africa will have opportunities to dominate the value chain of green hydrogen. So I guess these are the first steps in that happening. Yeah.
Exciting times ahead. And on top of all of these feel-good stories, I suppose, or as we've said at the top, what's going right for hydrogen, we've seen a lot of the big analysts in the industry predicting that 2025 is going to be a good year for hydrogen investment and scaling up these projects too, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes back to, look, if you've got the right business case, and depending on your colour or your shade of hydrogen, yes, there will be these good spells of investment. So we do need to remember that. It's what we said about having some perspective. It's not all doom and gloom. There are good things going on there.
Yeah, and on the theme of the shades of hydrogen, last year, right at the end of last year, Wood Mackenzie, the analyst, they said that US blue hydrogen is set to gain ground in 2025. They did say that the green hydrogen market will face headwinds, but as you said, there's a shade for everyone. Blue hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen. There's going to be a real momentum game for that throughout this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And the jury is always out on green versus blue, and then you've got this people trying to avoid the colour palette and just calling it low carbon, but why beat around the bush on that? I think our own HTView editor Charlie Curry delivered a column on that recently for online about, we're not colourblind, we do see the colours, but look, we just need to get the hydrogen in the ground, so to speak, and moving and doing what it needs to do to continue to prove the business case. So this isn't a bad thing. Yeah, we can get this twin track going.
And in the US, they are expecting at least 3 large-scale blue hydrogen projects to reach a final investment decision this year. That will exceed 1.5 million tonnes per annum for the successful progression of financial closes. And this would establish the US as a real leader in blue hydrogen production, certainly, wouldn't it?
It certainly would, yeah.
And crossing the pond, Europe too is, they're expecting hydrogen FIDs to scale up through 2025 as well. This is a forecast from Westwood Global Energy, who say that approximately 9 final investment decisions will be made in the European hydrogen sector throughout this year, and this could potentially involve large-scale projects, bigger than those that were approved last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if they're included in those numbers, but we've just talked about 2 or 3 on this pod alone that are taking FID this year or have already. So you'd have to think there's there's some good gravitas behind that.
Yeah, and this analysis does estimate that up to 500 megawatts of hydrogen production could reach FID this year, with notable projects including Uniper's 131 megawatt green hydrogen initiative. You've got 329 megawatts coming from the Catalana P2X project, and then the first 3 developments to secure a contract under the UK's HAR1 scheme. We'll get onto HAR a bit more shortly. So we've had great news from the producers, we've had great news from analysts within the industry, great news from us. We're positive about hydrogen going forward, but governments are also showing their support this year too, which is critical, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. And we've seen a number of feel-good stories, if you like, to that effect just in the last few weeks and months, haven't we?
We certainly have. And I'm going to bring to you this story, which was just a couple of weeks ago now, and this was where Life secured a €149 million subsidy from the French government to support its future green hydrogen production plant, which is located near the Grand Canal of Le Havre. Huge project, one that will be following, no doubt. This is where Life will receive an initial advance of €18 million by June of this year to cover investments that have already been made since 2022. So great to see the French government getting on board with this project.
This was certainly an eye-catching one when that story came into us, yeah.
And this is almost what drove some of our discussion in that large-scale projects webinar that we held just a couple of weeks ago now.
It was a good catalyst for that, for us thinking, look, we need to show some of the positives here and get on the front foot with that.
And let me bring you another positive then. We spoke about the HAR funding scheme earlier, but the UK government has shortlisted 27 successful projects under its Hydrogen Allocation Round 2, or HAR2, expected to deliver a combined 765 megawatts of low-carbon hydrogen production for deployment between 2026 and 2029. Great to see that in our home country here in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're aware there's an air of caution, perhaps confusion, certainly hesitancy in the UK hydrogen market at the moment. So that is exactly the kind of breakthrough or backing that I think everybody needs.
And this shortlist spans the whole of the UK. Scotland in particularly standing out. We're home to 8 of the 27 projects, I believe, and a lot of these have published capacity data, and Scottish projects alone account for 35% of that total, 765 megawatts of hydrogen.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, we I remember there being a lot of talk about Scotland and its hydrogen potential 5 years ago, say, and it's good to see some of that, come into fruition at some point. It's not just put on the back burner forever, so that's good.
And moving to the EU, yes, I suppose.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And the EU's widely anticipated Clean Industrial Deal has introduced key hydrogen measures to break through regulatory financing and scaling challenges facing the industry. Seen some contrasting views on this story, I think, but this should break through these scaling challenges that we are seeing in the hydrogen industry across Europe, and help those projects that we discussed earlier too.
Yeah, exactly. I said right at the start, didn't I? It's those challenges with scale up and with infrastructure. So if we can break down some of those barriers as hoped for with that story, then that's really important.
Yeah, really important. And I've got one final story to bring you if you've got time. And Moeve will begin construction on its 2 gigawatt green hydrogen hub in Andalusia this summer. And we caveated this with government showing support, and we've put that in this section because that is after the Spanish windfall tax rejection, where earlier this year, Spain's minority government did fail to extend a 1.2% windfall tax on energy firms with revenues over €1 billion. So more great news coming out of the EU there.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think this is, what's the term I heard in the last month? It might have been from one of the energy majors, disciplined hydrogen investment or disciplined green investment. That's what we're seeing.
So they're the stories close to home, but look, there are plenty more feel-good stories out there. There's plenty of promise in Oman, but India, and so many others too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I forgot to even mention the Middle East earlier when I was talking about South America and Africa and APAC. Of course, the Middle East. drenched in sunshine and all the right conditions to produce green hydrogen, and a very favourable state backing for whatever initiatives it does decide to go with. So, a lot of promise there. And I think for me, kind of summing up, is look, there is still a lot more happening in hydrogen today, as proven here, than 5 years ago, when we were all so pumped and so excited about hydrogen, when we all believed in the cause and we were so upbeat about it. There is still far more going on now than there was 5 years ago, and I think it's important we keep that perspective, and all the things we've talked about just in this episode, and there's so much more beyond that. It all comes down to the business case, and I think building blocks. We talked about that story with the 3 gigawatts, and it's going to be building in increments of 1 gigawatt at a time. It's building blocks. That's what this all says to me. We're going to get through this hydrogen winter, but we've got to take sort of baby steps to move out of it.
Like you say, we've come such a long way, and like you said on our webinar just last week, the road was never going to be straight. There was always going to be some bumps. There's always going to be some twists and turns. And just to do some on-air brainstorming, we mentioned all these regions. Perhaps there's an opportunity for us to maybe cover every region on this podcast.
Yes, let's do that. I can already see an India special or two.
Yes.
China, perhaps. We could. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do some country specials.
And to round off this, we've mentioned this large-scale projects webinar a few times, and some of the themes in that do, of course, lend itself to this topic on this podcast today, on the 1895 podcast. So I'd like to revisit that webinar and bring you some clips. One from this large-scale projects webinar from Sam French of Hydrogen Energy. They are on the HAR2 shortlist, so let's listen to him.
We have focused on the UK as being a very attractive long-term hydrogen market. We think that the regulatory framework that's been set up by the UK government is very strong and leading the way in terms of some of the business models that have been developed. We were successful through the HAR1 scheme with a 20 megawatt project based in West Wales in Milford Haven, which will supply hydrogen to local industry. And we hope that project will get to FID very soon. And that should be up and operating and supplying green hydrogen early in 2027. So whilst 2027 is a couple of years away in terms of building these scales of tens of millions of pounds project, that's very near. So we're already through into detailed engineering, and that project is progressing well. We were also very pleased that we've made the shortlist for HAR2 with a 60 megawatt project up in Teesside. That's at an earlier stage. Clearly, we're one of 27 companies included in the process that will go through shortlisting to be actually down selected as part of HAR2. But it shows that we are very keen on, very set on making the UK one of the key markets for Morgen. And we see the environment that's been set up within the UK as a very positive one. One thing that should state for these projects, whilst in the UK, the way the business model works is the off-takers can essentially access hydrogen at the cost of natural gas. We shouldn't underestimate the risk of change. And I know the UK government put a lot of effort in through things like the Intensive Energy Transformation Fund, to help support off-takers moving away from the counterfactual, generally natural gas, to hydrogen. But we also have been running trials with some off-takers to de-risk that change that they have to make and allow us to contract with them for the long term. And some of these HAR1 projects will have 15-year contracts.
Sam French of Morgen Energy there. And we also touched on scaling up the entire hydrogen ecosystem. Rob and I, we just did that a second ago, didn't we? So let's hear what Sam says about that too.
what we're doing as a company, one of the things that what we've got to do to really expand the hydrogen ecosystem is to learn by doing. I think there have been a lot of studies written, a lot of reports out there, but really now the next few years is about getting projects on the ground. I'm fairly confident that they won't all go as smoothly as we would hope, but what we will do, we will, as an industry, we will learn from these. What we'll also be able to do is really get to the understanding of what's needed to drive to the really large projects, which, as we've stated, is the way to drive down the cost. And we need to be doing this end to end. This isn't just one element of it. We need to be able to work with the right parties. One of the things that actually really is critical when we're looking at these projects is accessing the grid. And being able to get a good grid, stable grid access, the production facility, and then the transport, and then the off-taker, lining all of those up. So what we're doing now by deploying projects such as the one in West Wales at 20 megawatts is learning and being able to de-risk future projects. So I think that's critical. I think that's something that will happen over the next few years, and that will really allow the larger projects to develop and to be able to then to drive down the costs. Don't underestimate the effectively the cost within the levelized cost of hydrogen that comes from financing, and underlying that is risk. Really, though, to make the large-scale projects work, once we've got that learning as a sector, the critical things will be about policy certainty and essentially revenue support. So how are we going to be able to finance these things and finance the OPEX long term? We talked before about a carrot and stick. So in the near term, it's the carrot and it's subsidy on the OPEX side, more so than capital grants that are going to make projects financeable and fundable. Whether that comes from a demand side support or a producer support. There are different models in different countries, but effectively a way that we can minimize the impact on the off-taker from a change in their feedstock. I think then the second thing that's critical is the permitting and infrastructure alignment. It isn't easy to permit these projects. It isn't an easy thing to find the right locations, as we mentioned, with the grid infrastructure, but then being able to get the permitting and particularly for pipelines, and how we do that and how that's lined up across countries. I think despite a hiccup, as I mentioned, late last year, Denmark are now showing that it can be done. But I think Germany's really been leading the way in the kind of large-scale pipeline infrastructure, and how quickly they've been able to move to actually start implementing and building rather than spending a lot of time in the design and permitting stage. I think the last point on that would then be back to this sector view. It's about partnerships and how we all work together. There's no doubt that things like the capital cost of electrolyzers are critical to getting projects moving forward. So we do need to see improvements in technology in terms of efficiency and degradation rates within the electrolysis process. But that's only one element of it. We need that, as mentioned, the grid element to come through. How do we deal with getting the grid into the right places for us to grow these projects? Then off-takers, how are we going to de-risk that off-take to make sure we've got that demand base so that when we put these projects down, we can get them through and financed? And I do see that the early projects will have more focus on that risk, but as we as a sector get more knowledge and learning, that's going to help for the future.
And finally, let's just rewind another month and go back to the finance webinar that we held back in April 4th, shall we? Now, this was a webinar that we put on to discuss all the financing nuances and essentially discuss FID, which we've covered a lot today on this episode. And joining us on this webinar was Matt Hardwick of King & Spalding, Adam Forsyth of Longspur Capital, and John May of Hamilton Clark Sustainable Capital. So let's just get a few highlights from that webinar too, shall we?
I think what we're seeing is an evolution of the market. We're seeing a lot of these big projects getting delivered, achieve FID, others not, and there are reasons for that. And then we're seeing a shift in the market. So certain types of projects are really finding their way through, whereas others aren't. So we could come on to that and the reasons why we're seeing that and some of the trends later. I think that more recently within the EU, we've seen a quite clear direction of travel on how these projects will need to be structured, and the requirements for the green hydrogen qualifying as RFNBO, a renewable fuel of non-biological origin. I think it's not helpful that there's discussion around relaxing some of these rules, and that might seem counterintuitive in the sense that, well, if you relax the rules, more projects will get delivered. But there are a number of projects that are relying on the rules as set. If they're sourcing, let's say, grid-based power, they're looking at a requirement to get built by 8, and that's giving them a competitive advantage if they can get there. If that date's being pushed out further, other projects will come in and fill that gap. So, there's two sides to every story. So I think, regulatory certainty is a must. Everyone needs to know what they're building is correct, it's compliant with regulation, and it can get banked on that basis.
I think there is an appetite. I mean, very simply, if the promise of the right return for the perceived level of risk is there, investors will tend to come and find you. I mean, we part of our business, although I'm in the research business, a big part of our business is providing advice to both projects and companies looking for funding at both private, public, debt and equity. And the issues are clearly therefore around these risks, both perceived and actual. And we are seeing progress. We write research on a company called Atome, for example, which has fairly recently announced the non-binding heads of terms on equity for 50% of its project in Paraguay. And this is it started life as a clean ammonia project, but has now moved to a clean fertilizer project. And that feels like it's moving in the right direction. And the elements there, I think, as Matt said, is offtake there? Is offtake reliable? Is it secured? Can investors believe in it? Are the inputs right? Obviously, in this case, it's a long-term PPA, power purchase agreement, into the project.
I think as an investment banker, I'm trying to support these early stage technology companies in getting to commercial scale by helping them raise equity. I think when they get to the point where they're ready to do project financing, I think whether it's the US or Europe, the incentives such as the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits in the US, such as the revenue certainty mechanism and contract for differences approach in the UK and perhaps elsewhere in Europe. I think those are tremendously important. Any decarbonization of an industry needs some sort of incentive mechanism. If I go back in my career, this is one last final point, when I got involved in biofuels initially, seemed like a great idea because it was decarbonizing the fuel sector. But ultimately, we had to put in place in the US the renewable fuel standard. And then on top of that, the low carbon fuel standard that got adopted ultimately in most of the states in the US. And without those incentives, the history would have been quite different in terms of the scale up of biofuels and later SAF, sustainable aviation fuels. So we need these incentives. I'll give one last quick anecdote. I was asked to give a presentation to the UK Jet Zero Council last year on first commercial scale project financing. And I spoke with Philip New, the former head of biofuels at British Petroleum, who was the one who came up with the contract for differences revenue certainty mechanism, ultimately, along with the rest of the colleagues at the UK Jet Zero Council. But I thought that was really a great idea, and so I think Europe and the UK are sort of light years ahead of the US in terms of optionality and different approaches to incentivizing these projects. And particularly under the Trump administration, we're not seeing any incentives at all. And we're waiting to see whether the Congress is even going to refund the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits like Section 485, Z, V, et cetera, for fuels like hydrogen and SAF.
Our thanks to Matt, Adam and John there for their time a couple of weeks ago. I think that's about all we have time for today, isn't it, Rob? We've mentioned those couple of webinars. Listeners can go back and watch either of those on gasworld.tv, where you'll also be able to sign up for a second large-scale project webinar that will be bringing viewers on August 8th, so you don't want to miss that. If you clicked on this podcast, you may notice that it is called Part 1, and that's because I think we need to revisit this, and maybe not next week, maybe not even in a couple of weeks, but down the line this year, let's revisit these feel-good stories and these great projects that are getting FID, that are getting over that line. So we'll return to this theme later in 2025. But in the meantime, do please like, follow, and share the 1895 podcast.